I'm your host, Damian Pardo, and welcome to the 4WardMiami show. 4WardMiami is a local nonprofit that works on diversity and inclusion issues. And I have as my guest today, very privileged to have as my guest, Rosa Maria Paya Acevedo. And we're going to talk about communism. We're going to talk about Colombia. We're going to talk about what's happening in the region, in the Caribbean, and why that matters to everyone here that's living in South Florida.
Great. Thank you so much for having me, Damian.
Oh, my pleasure. I wanted to talk a little bit, Rosa Maria, about Colombia, since the elections were just yesterday, and I guess they're going to a runoff, and maybe you can help inform us as to the dynamics that's playing out in that country.
For sure. I mean, Colombia has been like a very wanted country for totalitarians in the region, for the Cuban dictatorship, for the Venezuelan dictatorship. They have been always working with the drug dealers in Colombia, with the guerrilla in Colombia. Just to give you a little bit of context, one of the main guerrilla movements in Bolivia that started in 1964 was created and trained by the Cuban dictatorship in the mountains of the Escambray, in the center of the island. They trained there in 1963 for a whole year, and then they went to Colombia and they created the Liberation Army, the ELN by their initials in Spanish. And that guerrilla have been working with the Cuban dictatorship for decades now.
So one thing I want to say is, I think for the average American, the average South Floridian, they don't believe that communism is even a factor. Like, it sounds a little bit ridiculous to a lot of people. And even when like Mitt Romney was talking about Russia being the number one threat, like everybody laughed him off, made fun of him. And I think we're in a similar situation when we talk about communism. Can you explain, or try to explain, for the average South Floridian what that is, what that means in the context that you use it?
Yeah, and I really got it, because it's not something that here in Florida or in the States you are in contact with, like in your daily base. But reality is that through the Cuban dictatorship, these forces that we identify with communism, and actually they are communist. The Cuban dictatorship is a totalitarian communist dictatorship since 1961. Those forces have been acting in our hemisphere and have been infusing destabilization, infusing crime in our hemisphere for decades now. And those forces are also very well connected with for instance, the drug dealer activity through the guerrillas, as we just mentioned, in Latin America, but are also very well connected at the political level. Just to give you a little bit of context, in 1991, just after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when everybody think that communism just ended, right?
Ended, it's over.
In that moment, the Cuban dictatorship, together with other extreme left forces in the region and some criminal forces, as some guerrilla movements in the region, they created something called the Foro of Sao Paulo, which is
the forum of
the Forum of Sao Paulo.
Sao
Sao Paulo was the city where it was created. And for almost 30 years now, that organization have been working in helping the extreme, many times communist forces to get to power. You know who was the first president that the Foro of Sao Paulo got to power? Hugo Chavez.
Wow.
And just see what happened in Venezuela. And of course, after 1998, with the money of Hugo Chavez, which is actually the money of the Venezuelan people, and the organization of the Foro Sao Paulo, and all the support of the Cuban dictatorship, well, these dynamics and these extreme forces have been getting to power in other regions and in other countries in our hemisphere. And right now we have Bolivia, also with the government of the Foro of Sao Paulo. We have Honduras with the government of the Foro of Sao Paulo. We have Mexico with a government that is also from the Foro of Sao Paulo. Sometimes these governments go as far as installing a dictatorship, as it happened in Venezuela, as it happened in Nicaragua, and in other times they are just accomplices of the Cuban regime. And we're seeing now that with Mexico, that is actually blackmailing United States because the President Biden took the coherent decision of not inviting the Cuban dictatorship to the Summit of the Americas.
So can you explain a little bit about the Summit of the Americas? It's happening now?
It's
in
happening
Los
next
Angeles?
week.
Next week?
In Los Angeles. Is the Summit of the Americas is a gathering of all the governments of the Americas that are represented in the Organization of American States, the OAS, as everybody knows it. Of course, the Summit of the Americas is also a moment for the democracies of the region to reaffirm themselves and to talk about the most pressing issues in the region. For instance, migration. For instance, crime. For instance, corruption. And of course, there are some rules. There is a very important and famous chapter, which is the Inter-American Charter, a letter that was signed by all these countries in 2001 that established those rules. And the first of that rules is, of course, the right to democracy of the people. So it's only coherent that the United States is not going to invite dictatorships to that table. But as in our region, we have so many governments that are actually accomplices of those dictatorships, that comes from the Foro of Sao Paulo, that comes from the communist forces, that comes from criminal forces. Well, in the region now we have a push not in favor of democracy, but in favor of dictatorships. So it's very important what is going to take place in LA next week. And it's very important also that we, as citizens of the Americas, understand the threat, the big threat that we have in front of our faces. You just mentioned Russia. The Cuban dictatorship is the best ally of the Putin regime in our region, but with very concrete and specific actions. The Cuban regime, for instance, the Cuban regimes control several media agencies in the region, not only Prensa Latina, which is the official Cuban press agency, but also Telesur, which is the press agency that Hugo Chavez founded, but also Hispan TV, which is the Iranian press agency also operating in the region. All these press agencies are controlled by the Cuban regime, by the Cuban intelligence apparatus. All these press agencies have been spreading the lies of the Putin regime in the hemisphere, calling Nazis to the Ukrainian people that is defending themselves. The Cuban regime, for instance, have been helping the Putin regime to try to change the position of several governments in the Americas, and we now know that they are very influent over those governments, trying to change that position for them to recognize the so-called republics of Donetsk and Luhansk in Ukraine. The Cuban regime have been doing the same thing also with governments in Africa, which they have a very good relationship with too. And in turn, the Putin regime has actually threatened United States with sending Russian troops to Cuba. They actually got so far as threatening, and I'm talking about the foreign ministry of the Putin regime actually threatened the United States with a second Cuban missile crisis. That's something that that's public information. Yeah. That's in public TV in Russia.
Why isn't those threats sound like they're very newsworthy? Why isn't this covered? Like, why doesn't the average American know a lot of what you're saying?
Well, that information comes actually from Reuters. They actually published it when the deputy prime minister of Russia and then the foreign minister of Russia started this kind of speeches about Cuba, and always trying to blackmail United States in the process. For instance, they threatened with sending Russian troops to Cuba if the talks with United States fail. That's the kind of language that they use, and that's the threat that the Cuban regime poses, not only for United States, but for the whole region. I do believe that, yes, as you mentioned, these topics do not get to the big public, right? Do not get in CNN and even Reuters and other national news agencies, and it could be there could be many factors to do to that actually contribute to that happening. Ideological bias could be one of them, but it's also very difficult for any news right now to make a national impact with everything that is taking place.
I mean, if we take a step back, at least the way I see it, the movement and what I'll call right now like the communist dictatorship totalitarian movement really is born from an equality of people, of the masses, an equal treatment, an equal benefit, an equal economy. I mean, that's the promise. But what we've seen time and time again is that promise has never been fulfilled. And in fact, those people end up much worse in their economies than they had been before those governments took power. So how is it that even in this country, and I think part of it in this country is that we believe we don't know communism, it can't happen here, it doesn't exist here, but yet for those people that are more familiar with it or have lived it, they see it already in many places and in many policies and in many social advances that are happening current day that really do mirror what's happened in those other countries. And so politically, especially in a place like South Florida, where you have, they're bringing up that communism again. Well, they're bringing it up because it works. And just my advice to anyone in politics would be get behind it, understand the why and the symbols and the reasoning, because it's there. It's not made up. Exactly. It's not a figment of people's imaginations. And really, the saddest part for me behind all of that is that the wantings behind the movement are all good. I mean, at the end, we all want people to be better off. We want people to be educated. We want them to have healthcare. We want, right? Those are basic things. But then there's a huge disconnect.
It is, and your point is so timely, because of course that these criminal organizations, which is what they are at their cores, these criminal organizations take advantage of all the imperfections in our societies. There are many. Yeah. We need to get better in many aspects, in many fronts, from healthcare to access to education,
I'm glad
quality
you're saying
education.
That.
Of course. And if that is a reality for United States, imagine for Colombia, imagine for the rest of Latin America, where so many people have suffered the corruption of governments in power across the ideological spectrum. This is not a threat for the right. This is a threat for everybody. Left and right, everybody should unite against communism. Everybody should unite against corruption, against organized crime, which is what these folks are. They are criminals in power. That's what we have in the Cuban dictatorship. That's what we have in the Venezuelan dictatorship, in the Nicaraguan dictatorship. And of course, when they are campaigning, they make a good diagnosis, the same that we can make. The problem is that they do not have the solution. They only have a big capacity to lie to get to power. That's they lie their way up to power. And then they
military.
Exactly. Then when they are in power, they use the force to keep power. And that's what happened. Been taking place in Cuba from day one, in Venezuela from day one, in Nicaragua from day one. Be careful with Bolivia, be careful with Peru, and I was in Colombia last week, just before the elections, and in Colombia there are at least 3 millions of Venezuelans that have been displaced, forcibly exiled, escaping from the terror and the misery of communism, of dictatorship, and I was glad to see the Venezuelan people in Colombia mobilize to alert the Colombian people. They were Venezuelan folks, young folks, with signs saying, "Hey, ask Venezuelans why they are here.
Yeah.
Ask Venezuelans why they are here," and then hashtag anyone but him. And who was him? Him was Petro, which is the candidate of the Castroism, the candidate of the Cuban dictatorship, the candidate of the Venezuelan dictatorship. That was, of course, he has a beautiful speech, a beautiful platform about inequality, about all the problems that are actually very serious problems that the Colombian society has, but he is not the answer. He is just the
Vehicle.
the horse of the 4th of Sao Paulo, the horse of the dictatorships in the region, and that can go wrong in so many levels, especially for the Colombian people that could start to see their rights diminish, as they always do, starting by freedom of expression. But that's also that would be awful for the rest of the region. But because these folks, they are not only terrible for their communities and their peoples, they also fuel these criminal organizations in the region. And this guy is a former guerrillero. He was part of a guerrilla. And
it would also be awful for the United States, because Colombia is one of the few historically democracies that this country has been able to rely. I've always been struck by the lack of attention, the lack of integration, the lack of everything, honestly, engagement when it comes to the US and Latin America and the Caribbean.
Yeah.
You see China engaging enormously, in very strong ways throughout the entire region. And then there's no US. Economically, I just don't understand it. I don't know if you want to comment a little bit about that, or Colombia, or
it's not something that we can explain. The lack of competence, just to put it in simple words.
That's a good word.
That it is, because it is obvious that this region, the closest neighbors of this country, are the most important neighbors that this country has. Those should be the most strong, healthy relations that this country should have. And the neglectance of that reality across history. During decades, that the government of the United States have shown, well, the reason why the 4th of Sao Paulo and the Cuban dictatorships are so strong and so influent in the region is because they have had the space to do it. It's because...
Good point.
Of course. At the end of the day, yes, the Cuban dictatorship has an intelligence apparatus that was very well trained by the KGB, very well trained by the Stasi, that had all the money of the Soviet Union in one point, and then had all the money of the Venezuelan people through Hugo Chavez. But at the end of the day, it's a corrupt machinery, totally unable of produce anything. The Cuban economy is just non-existent. They live from what they rob from other countries and from other governments.
And the Cuban narrative is that an embargo has kept them from being able to really fulfill a good economy. But we know they trade freely with the whole world.
Exactly. They trade freely. They actually, United States actually one of the 5 best commercial partners of the Cuban regime, even with the embargo, and they have had this big amount of money flowing from the Soviet Union in one point, then from Venezuela.
The oil. Yeah.
Actually, Venezuela still give oil to the Cuban regime. Actually, one of the things that the Putin regime did just a few weeks before they invade Ukraine, they just forgave for 5 years the $2.2 billion debt that the Cuban regime has with the Putin regime that comes from the Soviet Union era. So they have had a lot of money flowing towards their pockets, and we are not taking into consideration the money that comes from crime, the money that comes from drug dealers, the money that comes from trafficking in persons that the Cuban regime is
or
doing.
sex tourism. Or...
Exactly. We are not taking into consideration the remittances. We're not taking into consideration the travels to the island. There are a big amount of money flowing towards their pocket. The thing is that they are just totally unable to administrate that money for the good of the people.
And I think part of that is the lack of freedom, a big part of that, because there is no entrepreneurialism. There's very little, and when there has been, it's been very manipulated and very coerced. There hasn't been an ability for people to succeed and flourish and in any kind of economic way.
That's just a reality. Well, my father that was killed by the Cuban regime 10 years ago. Actually, next July 22nd is going to mark the 10-year anniversary of his murder. He used to say that for the market to be free, you need free men and women. First the person, first the individual, and then everything else.
Yeah.
And that's just the reality in Cuba. That's why.
And all your father did was ask for free elections and,
Exactly.
and petition in a peaceful manner. He led the Varela Project, which became an international movement, and for that he was assassinated. And that's the Cuban reality.
That's what you risk in Cuba when you dare to speak your mind. That's what you risk. You risk your life.
Let me ask you, what's the solution? I mean, we've done a good job, I think, of laying out that problem. How do you see light at the end of the tunnel? Because that's also what a lot of people say. Oh, there's just no solution to it. Let it go. Ignore it.
Well, there are two very important things there. The first one is that the problem is not going to disappear just because you ignore it. The problem is going to knock your door. Actually, it's knocking United States doors right now in a very literal way. At least 110,000 Cubans have crossed the southern border in the last 6 months. That's a migratory crisis, immigration crisis, equivalent to the Mariel crisis in the 80s, but actually equivalent. During Mariel crisis, there were 150 now. And why is that taking place? Because a coordinated operation between the Nicaraguan regime, another dictatorship, and the Cuban dictatorship. The Nicaraguan regime, because of an order of the Castro regimes, removed the visa restriction for Cubans in November last year. Well, since then, at least 110,000 Cubans has crossed the southern border. And of course, escaping from the dictatorship, but also being used by that dictatorship to destabilize this country and to put pressure over this administration that actually reacted by collaborating with the agenda of the Castro regime.
I think most people don't put those pieces together. In other words, that immigration crisis that was created was the leverage that the Cuban regime had on the Biden administration to move back its sanctions and to change its policies on remittances.
And it worked. The frustrating thing is that it worked. Even when we alerted this administration from the day one, they are planning another Mariel. They are going to try to blackmail you. The solution is to support the demands of the Cuban people. To your point, the solution is to support the Cuban people's demands, not the dictatorship's demands. That's only going to extend the problem. And the Cuban people's demands are very clear. are freedom and democracy. And to your point again, the solution is a combination of the Cubans' mobilization and the mobilization of the international community. And Cubans, well, we are doing a lot. We're putting our lives in the line. There are more than 1,000 political prisoners in this moment. The Cuban people were shouting in the streets, freedom, patria y vida. We want to recover our motherland. We want to recover our life. Last week, 2 days ago, the people were chanting freedom again in a concert. Last month were at least 293 public protests registered in the island. They are not in the news.
Last month, 293 public protests.
Exactly. That took
And
place
none
in
of this is
Cuba.
reported, though. I mean, I'm
No.
kind of shocked that none of this is making news to people that should hear about it because they care.
Exactly.
And if they don't, they should.
Exactly. The Cuban regime.
And my guess is that the Biden administration, already being vulnerable here politically, probably thought, you know what, we can't afford yet another problem.
Well, they are well informed on the protest and on the actions that they should be taken.
Why do you think they don't? Why don't they take the actions that are being recommended?
Incompetence from the part of the people that is taking these decisions, that is dealing with the Cuban dictatorship, is the more indulgent sin that I could think of to explain what is going on. Because the Biden administration has the opportunity provided by the Cuban people at the streets, demanding freedom, of supporting that demand, of supporting the Cuban people, helping them to have a better connectivity, of denouncing the legitimacy of the Cuban regime, of inviting everybody in the region to do the same, of embracing the Sullivan principles, which is actually what the American administration did to end or to help to end the apartheid in South Africa. And they could take a similar approach with the Cuban people. They could go harder with sanctions against the individuals that are sending young folks under 18 years old to prison for 8 years, for 9 years. They could go harder on the criminals that are in power and that are not only committing crimes against humanity, but are big criminal chief that control corruption not only in our island, but also in Venezuela and in other parts of the region. They could actually help the Cuban people to create the kind of critical mass that force those criminals in power to give in to the will of the people peacefully, but with pressure. And that pressure needs to come from within, and is coming, but also from outside. Instead of that, well, the Biden administration is collaborating with the agenda of the Cuban regime, because that was what happened 2 weeks ago when they announced these concessions.
So what you're saying really is clear as far as a solution and a way out.
It's
international pressure using things like the Sullivan principles, a model of apartheid in South Africa, getting all of the international countries using our leadership and our leverage to build that kind of consensus, and to use targeted specific sanctions as much as possible against the people that are promoting these bad policies that are putting kids, basically young kids, in jail.
Exactly. That at the end of the day, that's something doable. That's possible now. And that's especially crucial in a moment in which the Cuban people is so willing and ready to be the protagonist of this history. They are doing it, but they need the international support.
And they are doing it with no amplification. Nobody knows they're doing it. Nobody's hearing their cry. Nobody's helping. Nobody's,
Exactly.
it's like a bad, well, it's not a fair comparison, but it's kind of like a bad situation like Ukraine, but just not as bad. It's not a war. It's not, but it's been a slow burn.
It's the most imaginable disadvantage, the one that the Cuban people has, and the only way to fix that big disadvantage is with the support of the international community. In the moment that the international community decided to collaborate with the agenda of the Cuban regime or to look away, in that moment, what they are doing is condemning the Cuban people.
Wow.
And they are just allowing the Cuban regime for the greater impunity, which is what they have right now, Damian.
That's very, very sad. And hopefully your recommendations and the recommendations of other people like you will be heard. And hopefully there'll be some changes, not just here, but throughout the world when it comes to dictatorships and communism. I always love having you on the show because you bring so much information and so much light to this topic. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
No, my pleasure. And for everyone out there, thank you for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you again next